You ever notice how debates about religion can feel like you're stuck in a loop? You know, the same arguments just keep popping up over and over again. Well, today, we're going to dive into an article by Dr. Jorge Pires that does something really interesting. It doesn't just list these common arguments for Christianity, it actually breaks down why they feel so predictable. Let's get into it.
And to kick things off, the author doesn't pull any punches, leading with this zinger from George Carlin. This quote basically sets the stage for the whole analysis. It's a heads up that we're not just going to repeat these arguments, we're going to examine the logic, or as the author suggests, the potential lack of it, behind them.
So the whole premise of the article is this. Conversations about Christianity often seem to follow a pre-written script. The same defenses are used time and again, but, they're rarely looked at closely for how they're built or what their historical context really is. And that's exactly what we're going to get into here.
According to the author, when the logic starts to get tricky, discussions often hit a dead end with that classic line, well, you have your opinion and I have mine. It's the ultimate conversation stopper, right? So what we're really going to do is look at the function of these arguments, not just what they say, but why they're used and how they work to end a debate. All right, let's dive into the first big theme the article tackles, arguments that are all about the central figure of Jesus. This is often the absolute bedrock of the entire conversation.
Okay, so a really common starting point is this idea that Jesus was this universally good, wise, and peaceful moral teacher. It sounds like a pretty solid foundation, but the article pretty much immediately starts to poke holes in that idea.
And to challenge that idea, the author brings in a heavy hitter, the philosopher Bertrand Russell. This quote right here completely reframes the conversation. Suddenly, the unparalleled wisdom of Jesus isn't a given. It's a point of serious historical and philosophical debate.
So the article breaks this down even further with a few key points. First off, the whole idea of threatening people with eternal punishment doesn't exactly scream peaceful, right? Then there's the kind of strange story about cursing a fig tree, which is presented as maybe not the wisest move. But here's the real kicker. The author argues that even if you agree Jesus was a wise teacher, it's a massive leap in logic to say that proves he was divine, especially when other profound figures like Buddha and Socrates aren't held to that same standard.
Okay, so after looking at the central message, the author shifts gears and takes on the historical actions of the religion's followers. This is where we move from philosophy to the messy, tangible world of history.
So you've probably heard this one before, right? It's a defense strategy the author points out, trying to separate the faith itself from the terrible things some of its followers have done. The argument goes that anyone who committed atrocities couldn't have been a true Christian. It's a clever way to draw a line in the sand and say, nope, that wasn't us.
But the author says, not so fast. For instance, take the claim that Christianity was some kind of progressive force for women. The article hits back by pointing to verses in the Bible that were used for centuries to do the exact opposite, to enforce a patriarchal system. The argument here is that the justification for this kind of social order was baked right into the scriptures all along.
And it's the exact same story when it comes to slavery. The author pushes back on the idea that Christianity was some great reformer of slavery by highlighting passages from both the Old and New Testaments that seem to condone it. And the point the author makes is that for centuries, these were the verses used by Christian slaveholders to justify the whole system.
And just to put the scale of this into perspective, the article points to massive, long-running historical events. To counter the Christianity cause no harm idea, the source highlights centuries of brutal conflict, from the Crusades to the Inquisition and the witch hunts. The author's point is that these weren't just a few bad apples. This was widespread, systematic violence, often directly justified by religious doctrine.
So this all leads to a pretty bold conclusion from the author. The argument is that it wasn't an internal change. It was outside pressure from secular humanist ideas that forced the religion to change its tune on things like slavery and women's rights, just to stay relevant in a changing world.
Okay, so what happens when you push back on all of this? When you challenge these historical and philosophical points head-on? Well, according to the article, the conversation takes a sharp turn. It's not about winning anymore, it's just about getting out.
The author points out this moment where everything changes. Once an argument gets backed into a corner, the goal isn't to find an answer anymore. The goal is just to find an exit.
And according to the article, this exit strategy follows a pretty predictable four-step pattern. First, you've got deflection, just completely change the subject. Next up is relativism, falling back on, well, that's just your opinion. Then, if that doesn't work, just disengage, end the conversation. And finally, the classic move, claim the other person is just uninformed and needs to go study up on theology.
And this one is a real conversation ender. The author calls this a form of gaslighting. It's a way to completely flip the script, make you the problem, and walk away looking like they took the high road, all without ever addressing your point.
The article also calls out a classic logical fallacy at play here, the straw man. By saying something like, "You just have strong feelings against Christianity," the person avoids the actual argument. See what's happening? Instead of dealing with your logic or your evidence, they attack your motives. It's a way to sidestep the actual debate.
So, all of this, where does it lead? It brings us to the author's final, big-picture takeaway. It really forces us to ask, what's the real point of these arguments in the first place?
And here it is, the central thesis of the whole article. The author's conclusion is that these common arguments aren't really tools for a logical discussion at all. They're more like defense mechanisms. They're a protective shell designed to deflect any criticism that gets too close to the core belief. The goal isn't to have a dialogue, it's to put up a shield.
And that leaves us with a really provocative question that honestly goes way beyond just this one topic. When any of our deeply held beliefs get challenged, what's really going on? Are we trying to understand each other and have a real dialogue, or are we just trying to defend what we already believe, no matter what? It's definitely something to think about.